Here's why you're hitting the wall at mile 20 and why your marathon training plan might actually be the reason it keeps happening. As a running physical therapist and coach, I've worked with hundreds of runners who are training for marathons, and the one most common thing that I see in runners who are following a generic training plan that can look great on paper, but is actually setting them up to either hit the wall, break down, or worse, get injured before they even make it to the start line. And the problem is that most training plans are built for a generic runner. They're not built for you. They're not built for the runner who is juggling a full-time job, maybe raising kids, training on tired legs at 5 a.m., and who really can't afford to spend 6 months training only to end up injured right before your big day and your marathon. So today I've brought in someone who I have a ton of respect for, Jason Fitzgerald, who is a USATF-certified running coach, 239 marathoner, and founder of Strength Running, one of the most trusted resources for recreational runners out there. And together, we're going to answer some of your questions in order to have your marathon training plan be the one that actually causes your next breakthrough, and is probably your current plan isn't addressing. So we're going to talk about like what workouts actually move the needle and which ones most runners are skipping entirely. We're going to break down what's really happening when you hit that wall at mile 20 and how your training, or lack thereof, the right kind of training, is the reason why. And if you're a runner in your 40s or 50s, we're going to talk about what training smarter actually looks like, specifically because your body is not the same as it was when it was 28. So your plan shouldn't be the same either. So Jason, welcome back for your fourth appearance on the Healthy Runner podcast. Really glad to have you here today.
Duane, thank you so much for the warm welcome. I very much appreciate it and excited to be here for appearance number 4. Has it really been that many?
It has. Yeah. Time flies, it does.
Time flies. We were just talking about that after I mentioned I've probably recorded about 600 plus types of podcasts over the years. So good Lord, here we go.
Yeah. And I really want to get into this. You recently actually made a video about why runners slow down at the end of races from a training perspective. What workouts or training habit actually causes hitting the wall? And is it fixable if we're like mid-training cycle right now?
Yeah, the good news is that it's definitely fixable. It's something that you can certainly address. And even if you're halfway into a marathon training program right now, that's still a lot of time to get in the key workouts that are going to help you not hit the wall after mile 20. Now, of course, some of it's not training related. We can certainly talk about nutrition and fueling, but we're learning a lot more about certain types of workouts that give you certain physiological skills. And there's been a lot of talk recently about physiological resilience. And it's really this, new arena of performance where we used to think about performance as like a stool with 3 legs. There's your running economy, your VO2 max, and your lactate threshold. From a physiology perspective, those are the things that are going to make you into a good runner. But we're now learning about physiological resilience, which isn't another leg of the stool. It's more like a way of describing the other 3 metrics and how they decline over time in a race. So if you don't want your running economy, your lactate threshold, your VO2 max to decline as much at the end of a marathon, in other words, hit that wall, bonk, really start slowing down, we've got to build in some kind of physiological resilience training into our marathon training program. So we can certainly do it with workouts. Part of it is also going to be fueling and nutrition. So we can take a more holistic approach to this problem.
Yeah, and I love how you kind of talked about that physiologic resilience, because from like a PT brain perspective, I tend to see that runners at the end of marathons are certainly reaching that physical like breakdown point where, their running form, their gait is collapsing, their hip flexors are fatiguing out and muscles are starting to seize up. So it is one of those things that, and I'm sure, of course, we're going to get to, strength training at some point today, because that's kind of your bread and butter as well, is just, training those muscles so they can handle the demands later in that race, right? So we're kind of preparing our muscles to tolerate when, everything's burning out from a nutrition standpoint, but also like a muscle breakdown standpoint and cardiovascular standpoint at the end of a marathon. Because, yeah, marathon is not easy, right? If it was easy, everyone would do it. They're becoming more popular nowadays than they were, 20 years ago. However, not everyone can run a marathon. So if you're, training for one right now, you can certainly do it. And I'm sure some of Jason's tips today is going to really help you be able to kind of break through that barrier. And, looking at workouts, Jason, like when we are thinking about workout types that someone needs to conquer a marathon, regardless of experience level. And we can even, break that out to like what a novice, maybe first, second marathon versus someone who's more experienced, or if you want to break it down to, times of a marathon, if someone was running like a 3:30 versus a 5-hour marathon, just to give some like examples on, what we do need to do from like a workout perspective during a marathon training block. Or if there's like any big errors or workouts that you find that runners usually skip.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's like the $1 million question, right? Like, what workouts do we do? How do we know when to do them? Who should do which workouts? It's certainly a complex question. I'll definitely say that, first of all, I'm glad that you mentioned that the marathon is just really hard. I've been describing the marathon as the final boss of road running. It is the most difficult road race that you can enter. It's very long, partly because of its length and intensity. It's just longer than the amount of time that your body can hold on to all its carbohydrates. So it forces you to try to bridge the gap between like mile 20 and mile 26. And that's really different than, say, a 50-mile race where you just slow down enough and fuel enough where you're not reaching so far into like zone 3 or potentially zone 4. So it is a uniquely difficult race. And so as long as we can just be, very self-aware, eyes wide open, this is a hard race. And if you've only been running, let's say 9 months or less, definitely encourage you to focus on other races first. Let's build up our speed. That increases your, VO2 max and your running economy. And then that translates really well into marathon training. Become a better runner before you then go try to train for a marathon. But, if it's your first marathon, I tend not to divide runners into this is your first marathon or like your 7th marathon, because some runners don't run a marathon until they're already highly experienced, advanced runners. So their first marathon can be approached like a very advanced runner can approach a marathon, right? And so it's more about your training age, how many years of training that you have underneath you that will impact the kinds of workouts that you do. So let's say you've got a couple of years experience, consider yourself a beginner, intermediate runner, you're running your second marathon ever. I would focus on the fundamentals at this point. We don't have to get too fancy. And that includes probably 3 major types of workouts. So we can kind of put different workouts in these buckets of, what type of workout it is. And so let's go lower intensity to higher intensity. On the lower intensity side, we have marathon pace. Marathon pace for some runners is similar to their aerobic threshold. For some runners, it's more firmly in zone 3. It's a little bit more of a higher intensity effort depending on your ability. But nevertheless, it's an important pace to run because we do want the neuromuscular fitness of that particular pace of running. So in other words, we want our brain to really remember what this pace feels like, how to execute this pace, how to do it when you're fresh, how to do it when you're tired. Let's run marathon pace, when we're fresh on a Thursday, but then also on the back half of an 18-mile run on a Saturday when you're already fatigued, because we're teaching our body how to lock into that pace at a variety of fatigue levels. And so you're going to be much more likely to pace yourself more competently on race day if you practice it more during your training. And of course, there's the physiological benefits of running marathon pace. You gain extra endurance, probably a little bit more than you would in zone 2 or an otherwise easy effort. Now, the other workout intensity that I think is crucial for marathoners, and honestly probably every other type of runner, unless you're like an 800-meter runner, is lactate threshold. Lactate threshold is one of those paces or effort zones, I should say, that is like the gift that keeps on giving. It constantly pushes up the pace that you can run while still being aerobic. So running with oxygen, you're not going into oxygen debt. You're not feeling that burn in your muscles. It's that zone of effort right before you go anaerobic. And if you can train at this pace on a regular basis and gradually increase the duration of this effort, maybe gradually increase the pace over time. Now, that's a multi-year project right there, so don't do it over the course of a couple weeks, but gradually over time, increase the duration and pace of these workouts, and you're gradually going to be able to run faster and faster while still being aerobic. And this is probably one of the most important types of workouts for distance runners, whether you're training for the 5K or the 50-mile race distance, because again, it's like the highest end endurance pace that you could possibly train at. And so it's not super specific to the marathon, but it's building the type of runner who can run a fast marathon. And then finally, the last type of workout is your classic VO2 max workout. All the longevity bros have been talking about the 4x4 VO2 max workout ad nauseum on social media these days. We don't really want to copy that as runners. There's a whole variety of VO2 max workouts that we can run, but generally speaking, it's usually 10 to 20 minutes of higher intensity interval running with a 2 to 4 minute recovery jog. And you're basically going to be running about your 2 mile to 5K race pace. So it is very intense, but we don't do it for very long interval lengths. We might only be running 600 meters to 1,000 meters, 3 to 5 minutes at this effort. And this is really going to help our body learn how to deliver more oxygen to our working muscles. It's a very uncomfortable type of effort, so we don't want to be doing it every single week. We certainly want it periodized within the training program, maybe clustered into the back half of the training plan or the final third of the training, just so that we're not peaking too early. You do a lot of VO2 max work early in a season, 20, 18, 16 weeks out from your goal race. You're going to find yourself in peak condition like 2 months early. And that's not where we want to be. We want you in peak condition on race day, ready to run, hopefully, a new personal best. So that's how I think about these workouts and kind of, and in terms of like who they're for, I think these workouts are great for beginners and for pretty advanced, even elite runners. The things that change from a beginner to even an elite runner is, primarily the pace of the workout, but also maybe the volume of the workout. So an elite runner might run 15 miles at goal marathon pace. That's probably a little bit overkill for your average runner, so we can scale that back. But the types of workouts are still going to be the same for almost everyone. With one big caveat, I would say maybe you're training for your first marathon. Maybe your goal is just to finish. Maybe your expected marathon pace is actually very close to your easy running pace, or it is your easy effort pace. In that case, I wouldn't do a lot of marathon pace running because it's really no different than your normal easy zone 2-ish effort. I might, err a little bit more on the side of those intense workouts so that we can just drive the fitness up even higher beforehand. So yeah, a lot to wade through and parse in that very long answer there, Duane. But those are the types of workouts that I would prioritize in any marathon plan. And then, of course, it's just up to the athlete to determine, the scale of the workout and the pace of the workout.
Yeah, no, that was a great whole breakdown of the different workouts. And if you're listening to this and you're coming to this kind of fairly new in your marathon journey, and what Jason is talking about is like kind of what we call speed work, right? Where we're adding in these faster paces. And, I'd be remiss to not add in from like the physical therapist lens and just seeing a lot of runners who kind of come to me injured, right? Where they're having Achilles pain or IT band pain because they've done, an AI training plan or the plan online that they were doing speed work, and maybe they didn't have the base or the foundation for that speed work to live, meaning they haven't built up the weekly volume of miles yet, or they haven't built up significant long runs in the double digits, or doing an hour and a half, 2 hour long runs. So I would say, if you are in that camp, then all of what Jason kind of described to you probably wouldn't be where you want to go in your marathon training cycle right now. But really what Jason's talking about is kind of getting to that like next level where you do want to PR, and maybe you haven't tried speed work in previous training, right? You just kind of put the miles in, cover the distance. So this is kind of where we take it to the next level. And then out of all those workouts that you've talked about, Jason, especially in my 50 plus, 40 plus, but 50-year-old plus, and I see more. We're both male, so I can bash our male identity here, but more males in their 50s who are just doing too much VO2 max work or workouts at 5K pace, interval pace. Like they're doing track workouts that they weren't ready for. And their mind was like, I'm going to do this because I'm going to, think back to what I did in high school, or think back to what I did 20 years ago, or I'm going to New York, I'm running this marathon, I want to like blow this thing out of the water. And they get all pumped up, they go to the track, and then they wind up, straining their calf, wind up getting Achilles pain. So out of all those workouts there, I would caution you guys that are listening, be careful with those, right? And make sure you have the solid foundation and you've covered the other paces that Jason talked about. And I like how you mentioned that marathon pace is one that, is more on the conservative end. And like, that's a great place to start if you're dipping your toe in some faster work. And then like with my athletes, I think you're a big proponent of this as well, Jason, is I always like to start out with like strides first, right? Before even, adding in any of these specific workouts. Do you do that as well?
Yeah, definitely. Strides, I think, are so fundamental. I mean, I have seen middle school track teams running strides and professional track athletes running strides. That's how, versatile they are. That everyone at any age, any ability level can run strides. And I'm glad you brought up having a foundation first. I mean, we are talking about the final boss of road races here. So yeah, we shouldn't go into any marathon program without being comfortable with some amount of volume. I usually like to see runners being somewhat comfortable at 30 to 40 miles a week, and then starting a marathon plan that gradually builds the volume. But the volume, and I really like, Duane, how you described this. You said the workouts need a place to live, and they live in the mileage. If you don't have the mileage, they have nowhere to go. That's an interesting way of putting it. It's the volume supports the workouts. If you can't run 5 miles, you can't run a 5-mile specific race workout, because you're going to have to do 5 miles of speed work. If you can't run 5 miles easy, you can't run 5 miles hard. You've got to kind of work at it from the volume perspective first. But at the same time, and this is a huge mistake I often see many marathoners make, is they build that foundation of aerobic fitness, but they don't build a foundation of speed. And I do think we should always be thinking about a base of speed as well, because it prepares us for the harder workouts, like those VO2 max workouts. Those aren't easy workouts. We've got to be very judicious with them. They're very intense. You have to be more conservative with them the older you get. You can't run them every week. You need that volume, but you also need to prepare for them based on the workouts you've done previously. So one of the types of workouts that I didn't even mention is what I often use as like a secondary workout during the week, a B workout. It's a repetition workout. So if you've ever read Daniel's running formula, it's an R workout or repetition workout, where you might be running something like 200 meters and you might run 4 or 6 repetitions of 200 meters with a 2 to 3 minute recovery jog. And you might be running your 800-meter or mile race pace, which is pretty fast, but you're getting good rest. The volume of this workout is very low. These are basically glorified strides. They're a little longer. They're probably not quite as fast, but they are kind of building the foundation of running economy, stroke volume for your heart, getting comfortable with faster speeds. And so you run those really short, fast workouts with good rest. And I also think it's helpful to differentiate between fast and hard. This is an example of a fast workout that's not very hard. VO2 max workout is both fast and hard. A marathon pace workout is not quite fast, but maybe it's hard if it goes on long enough. So you can see how workouts can be some combination of the two. 4 by 200 meters at mile race pace should be fast and pretty moderate in terms of its effort. And if you're building your fitness from both ends of the intensity spectrum, right? You're running strides, you're running, some type of repetition workout, 150 to 300 meters, pretty fast, but with good recovery and low volume. That's on the intense side of the spectrum. And then on the easy side of the spectrum, you're keeping your easy runs easy, you're building your volume, you're doing good long runs, you start running marathon pace workouts. Those might evolve into lactate threshold workouts. And then finally, you sort of meet in the middle with that VO2 max workout. I don't even know if we're talking about marathon training anymore, Duane, or just like how to periodize a training plan and evolve workouts from, week 1 to week 12 or week 16 of the training plan. But this is generally speaking like how runners should order and then evolve the workouts over time so that by the time they get to their goal race, they have the endurance, they have the speed, and they're also race ready. They're ready to express that fitness.
I love that. And I love how you said that they could be fast, but not hard. And I know for me, like our backgrounds are kind of, completely different in that you came from like the cross country younger runner where I was like an adult onset runner in my mid 30s, where I was new into it. And I think about like my first marathon training cycle where I would do some hard, VO2 max workouts on the track. And I was athletic, right? I was like, strength training in the gym all the time and was getting into running and was still kind of, dipping my toe, did the 5K, 10K, right? Half, and did a bunch of halves before I went for the full. And I could just think about all of those track workouts I did hard because I thought that was what I was supposed to do. Until I wound up getting some injuries and just realizing like, hey, you got to like do this smarter. So I love how you kind of emphasize that point of they can be fast and you're running at paces, but you're allowing more recovery and you're still keeping it in control. Like you shouldn't go 10 out of 10 effort during your workout or get to your race effort, right? Emptying the tank on your workouts because that is going to lead to overtraining during the training cycle, right?
Yeah, for sure. Even as a collegiate track athlete, most of the workouts we did were not 10 out of 10 workouts. It would be very rare where the coach would say, okay, this is a really hard day, guys. We might be running some of these repetitions at, what my college coach used to say, best effort, which is sort of just a race effort, like run as hard as you can while still being able to finish the workout. And so that's very rare. And I think it should be more and more rare the older you get. So if you're in your 50s or 60s or beyond, yeah, those kinds of efforts should be more and more rare because I think we should prioritize consistency and just staying healthy and injury free than trying to eke out the final, 0.4% of performance. Because, that's where we start running into those problems.
I truly hope that you're getting value from this video, and I wanted to take a brief moment to share with you one of my most recommended naturally sourced food supplements for runners that supercharges your recovery from running. And that is the power of black currants, which is a berry, by the way, just like blueberries, but they have the highest level of anthocyanins, which is a strong antioxidant of any berry. And Curins has a product that's conveniently packs these super berries into a capsule. As I frequently say, recovery is a part of the training, and you can only run as fast or as long as you can recover from that run in order to stay healthy for longevity. Curins is taken as a pre workout supplement, and it's going to help improve your recovery times and reduce the effects of fatigue or muscle soreness after a hard run or strength session. There are over 50 studies investigating the effects of these superberries, and Curins has been studied to improve blood flow by up to 45%, which removes metabolites from our muscles, reduces oxidative stress. In fact, a recent British study actually showed that Curins helped accelerate recovery of muscle function 3 times faster than placebo. And soreness in the active group reduced up to 49%. Tissue damage was reduced by 84%, which is attributed to the improvement in blood flow that was seen, as well as blackcurrant's anthocyanins' inherent antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. You can learn more about the real science behind blackcurrant extract with my interview with Fleur Cushman in the video that I have for you linked in the description if you want to learn more and get into some of the science. And having a supplement that is backed by science is important to me. And it's what I look at when I put anything in my body, and is the reason why I've been using Curins for the last 2 years, because I was looking for a supplement to help maximize my recovery from hard marathon training so I could stay healthy during the training. And now that you're a part of our Healthy Runner community, you can get 20% off your first order using the link that I have for you in the description. You can go to curinsusa.com. Just use the code HealthyRunner during checkout when placing your order. Go ahead and give Curins a try to help you recover from those runs. Trust me, you won't regret it. And I know you're such a big fan of all runners across the spectrum, whether you're training for a 5K or you're training for a marathon, that you're really, doubling down on the long run. So let's kind of talk about the long run a little bit. And like your top video recently was about making long runs less boring. But beyond the mental side, like what should a runner's long run actually look like? Should it be like steady pace? Should it be progression where they're gradually getting faster as they go? Should there be race specific segments? And is there such a thing as like slow, like too slow? Or how slow is too slow?
Yes, 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 and yes. All of the above. I am very agnostic when it comes to the structure and pace of long runs, because there's a time and a place for everything. And you give me 10 different runners training for 10 different goals, I will find you ways to use every different type of long run in a strategic way. I think generally speaking, maybe we can start with mistakes. Yes, there are definitely potential to run your long run too slow. I do believe there are paces that can be defined as too slow for any runner. If me and you go for a run, Duane, and we're running 14-minute mile pace, I've seen some of your workouts. I know that pace is just too slow for you. You're going to feel uncoordinated. You're going to feel like you're holding yourself back so much that you're just mentally frustrated. Your mechanics are going to suffer, and you're not going to get your heart rate to a level that is going to help you gain fitness or boost your aerobic fitness. So there is definitely such a thing as too slow. Now, there's also such a thing as too fast. We've got to find that Goldilocks sweet zone right in the middle of appropriate. That's really what we want. We want appropriate paces. They're not too fast. They're not too slow. And then within appropriate, you can have some long runs that are on the slower end of what's appropriate for you. Maybe you're fatigued. Maybe you're tired. Maybe your kid was up all night sick and you had to get up a couple times and you don't feel fully recovered from the workout you did 2 days prior. There's a time and a place to run pretty slow on your easy runs. And I'm a big fan of getting in something rather than not doing anything. So if you did have a rough night of sleep and you had a long run where you were going to run a certain segment at, say, your marathon race pace, but you're like, oh man, I'm going to risk an injury. I just don't feel good. It's warmer than I thought today on top of everything else. Maybe we just run it easy. So there's always like a plan B and C and D and E and on, that you can tailor these long runs or any workout really to how you're feeling and what you're currently going through. But then, we move up the difficulty ladder of long runs. Yeah, we can start doing long run progressions, where each mile or couple kilometers is a little bit faster than what it was before. So that maybe by the end of the run, you're touching marathon pace or half marathon pace or even your lactate threshold. I mean, I've done runs where I'll go to the track and I'll run 2 times a mile faster than my 5K race pace after 17 miles of running. That's a workout I've done. It's really hard and it's kind of crazy, but for what I was training for, that's what was recommended to me actually by my college cross country coach. So there's a lot of different variability in long runs. I really like hilly long runs. I like occasionally getting on trails and just running a similar time that you might normally run on the roads, but the distance might be a lot less because there's technicality, there's more elevation gain and loss. You might be at higher altitude if you're here in Colorado where I live. So there's a lot of wrinkles that you can add into a long run. And I want runners to always be thinking about what is a new wrinkle that I can add into my long runs to add a little spice, to add something unique to the run, to get a little bit more fitness out of it. So it could be, those fast intervals I mentioned that I used to do. That's actually a pretty good physiological resilience workout, running really fast when you're really tired. You could just throw in a 30-second surge every mile just to spice things up. There's really no good physiological reason to do that, but it's fun. It'll make the time go by faster. You're not going to defeat the purpose of the long run. It gets you out of the mindset that long runs are LSD, long, slow distance. They're not always long, slow distance. You can do whatever you want in a long run. You can make them into workouts if you want. You can do repetitions at your goal half marathon race pace, or a fast finish long run where you might run the final 3 to 12 miles at your goal marathon pace. So I don't really think there's a right answer here. It's like, here's a huge menu of long run options. Let's, as we go through the training cycle, let's order them from easier to harder, more general to more specific, and kind of create that long run progression from the menu. And of course, remembering the training age of the runner. If you've never run a 20-mile long run, let's get to the distance first before we start injecting, some of these workouts, some of these pickups, those kinds of things.
Right. Yeah. And our last chat actually on the podcast was about building like mental toughness. And when you're talking about like the progression run, for example, like I think that's a great one, to build that mental toughness, as well as, shake up the long run a little bit, have you running at a faster pace on tired legs as fatigue setting in. Because what we're talking about is just preventing that wall at mile 20, right? So the more that you do that in training and you're able to hit paces, you're able to overcome those obstacles, both physically, mentally, in training, then you're going to be able to do that on race day. So that's kind of what Jason's talking about, is just simulating that in training. And doing some specific, I think for, marathoners specifically, having those, again, if you're following kind of the progression and you're ready for it, is doing some of those marathon paced miles. And it can be something simple initially, guys. Like, you don't need to get crazy with it and do something like, for me, my level, doing 10 miles at marathon pace, and that I've only done that actually once straight through, but I've broken it up into like 5-mile increments where, you're doing a 6-mile warm up basically, and then you're doing 5 miles, then you're taking a half mile or a mile, running easy in between. And then you repeat those 5 miles again. Then you do cool down miles. That's a hard workout for my level of running, which right now is at like a 3:40, marathon time. like that's really hard. So, but you could start out small, guys. Like you can add literally like a mile and do mile on, mile off, mile on, mile off, maybe 3 times when you start out. Versus, I see a lot of runners, Jason, where they're like, I got to get under that sub 4 time, right? And they're like, okay, if my normal easy pace is at a 10-minute pace, then each week I'm going to try to increase that pace, and I'm going to try to run faster for each of those long runs, where I'm going to do 9:45 average pace, then 9:30, then 9:15, then 8:45, 8:30, right? I'm sure you see this as well in your runners, because
You're seeing me squirm over here, Duane. I'm so uncomfortable listening to this.
they're like, how am I going to hold that for like a whole marathon, right? So I have to be able to do that, and they try to do that every single week. But what Jason's talking about is being more strategic and having like specific miles that are the overall workout, where you're looking at what is the goal of this workout. Is it actually more of, yes, a long slow duration run, an LSD run, where we're just getting in easy miles? Like I'm actually doing that this weekend after coming off of a half marathon race, where I'm currently marathon training. I'm going to be doing 18 just easy, but like I will probably never do 18 easy again after this. So think about the goal of the workout, but then also within that workout, think about the goal. And if you are going to do those marathon paced miles, or you're going to do a progression run during the warm-up portion, the easy portion, keep it easy. Like don't overshoot it. Because I find that as a common mistake too, is if you're running just a little bit above where you should, like that can totally mess up your whole workout for the rest of the day. I don't know if you agree with that, Jason.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And I think the real value of a coach is being strategic with your effort. You might put the same effort into an upcoming marathon season, but the coach will redirect that effort in slightly different directions. So they might have you pull back on effort over here, but over here on workout day, we're going to put in even more effort. And so the coach can certainly help you be a little bit more strategic with these types of workouts. But I can't agree more that, start with real small bites of the apple here. Maybe you run 14 miles and the final mile is at your goal marathon pace. That's not a terribly hard fast finish long run, but it opens the door for even more hard workouts to come. And no matter what kind of workout we're talking about, whether it's a certain type of long run or it's a more speed oriented workout that you'll do during the week, I always think it's helpful to remember that for any workout, if you pluck it out of context and you just look at it by itself, you've got to know how to get to that workout and then what to do after that workout, right? So if you do 22 miles with the final 14, 15 miles at goal marathon pace, the only place to go after that workout is racing a marathon. There's very few other workouts that you could do that would be marathon specific, that would challenge you in a similar way as the marathon without actually just going to run a marathon. But you have to make sure that you're ready for that type of long run. And actually don't let me also like give a little caveat here. You don't have to do incredibly hard long runs. I think the most difficult long run I ever did before a marathon was 22 miles, and it was 11 miles out, 11 miles back. After I turned around, I did 3 times 3 miles at my current marathon pace for rep 1. Rep 2 was at my goal marathon pace. And then rep 3 was a little bit faster than goal marathon pace. And it had a 1 mile float. So not really an easy mile, but a little bit more of an up-tempo mile in between. And yeah, I mean, I basically was
That's
running.
Hard.
Yeah, it was 9 miles total at about marathon pace in the second half of a 22-mile long run. But it's also worth noting that I never ran more than 5 miles at marathon pace during any marathon cycle I ever did. You get a lot more out of the faster workouts. So don't think you have to go run 20 miles with 18 of it at marathon pace. Those are certainly helpful, really good for physiological resilience, preventing that breakdown at the end of the race. But it's also so advanced that you're really only going to see practically sub-elite runners attempting those kinds of workouts. And then I know a big part of this conversation is like how to prevent the fade at the end of a marathon. And we haven't talked about one of the best workouts for it, which is the downhill long run. And that's where you basically just do a normal long run, but the final, let's say 1 to 5 or 7 miles is going to be run downhill at about your race pace, maybe a little bit faster than race pace. And the goal here is muscle damage, which sounds really weird, right? Like, shouldn't we be avoiding this in training? If we do this too much, they're going to end up in your office, Duane. Like we don't want, well, maybe you want that, but I don't want that. And what this does to the body is that it creates this incredible super compensatory effect where you introduce a lot of muscle damage. And then because of the repeated bout effect, like very intense doses of damage, essentially, your body overcomes that. It super compensates, and you build a lot of resilience from those really damaging workouts. Now, of course, these aren't aerobically challenging, just to run kind of fast downhill, but your legs are going to be turned into ground meat by the end of these kinds of workouts. They're not fun the next day, but they build that incredible resilience. And, this is a workout that we're seeing a lot of ultra runners do, because obviously in a 100-mile ultra marathon, the potential to really fall off pace and fade is really high. So they're doing these, occasional bouts of pretty fast downhill running to introduce a little bit of muscle damage, to tempt Uncle Rabdo to come for a visit, but not actually inviting him in the house. And if you do that 3-ish times during the course of your marathon season, especially in the final half of the season, you're probably going to build more resilience than almost any other athlete on the starting line.
Yeah, that's definitely going to challenge those muscles to allow them to kind of repair and be stronger in the future. So another great tip there. And before we get off the long run, I'm kind of curious, do you set a time limit for your runners for the long run? Some people say, not over 3 hours, 3.5, or is that like not a concern for you?
I think for most marathoners, they'll be able to get in about a 20-mile run in 3.5 hours. So I do generally have a cutoff of about 3.5 hours. I'm a little bit flexible with it. I'm more concerned about, are you strategically building the long run in a way where even if your long run takes, say, 3 hours and 40 minutes, are you ready for that? Is that a manageable amount of time to be on your feet? So I'm more concerned about the progression, whether or not I think the athlete is ready for it. But also, yes, there's a little bit of concern about going, too far beyond, about 3.5 hours. I don't generally like that. And it's one of those things where, if you have trouble running 20-ish miles over the course of a marathon season, if you can't build to about that distance and be able to run it in about 3.5 hours or so, I might say, let's not focus on the marathon right now. Let's build some of the other skills like VO2 max, lactate threshold, your running economy. Let's focus on power output. Let's focus on durability. Some of the things that will then make marathon training a lot more manageable in the future. I think that might be a more strategic developmental approach for this hypothetical runner, because sort of like, the final boss of road races, you need to beat the prior bosses first. We need to develop some confidence with the 5K and the 10K and the half marathon, and then you're going to be in a much better position in your first marathon. Like I remember when I ran my first marathon, people were like, "Oh my goodness, you ran 2:44 in your first marathon in New York City. How did you do that?" And I was like, "Guys, I just ran track for 8 years. I've run about a 4:30 mile. Did you expect me to run a 4.5 hour marathon?" So
Right.
it's like you can build the skills for the marathon in a much easier way by training for shorter races first. And if the runner is taking that long to do a long run, they're probably a really good candidate for that approach.
Yeah. So good reminder, guys, that you can be patient. You don't have to run a marathon, even though it seems like all of your friends or social media following is. I love that, you're kind of preaching here of being patient and improving in those other distances first, and then, going for the marathon. And yeah, Jason, like I'll definitely be working with some like back of the packers or like some, Run Disney runners, who, they come to me injured because they did go out for a 20 miler, but it took them like 5 hours. And, that just consequence of the time on feet and the amount of, strain, amount of load to their, joints, to their tendons, to their ligaments. I was curious to kind of hear what your answer is for those runners. I'm a big fan of stimulating fatigue prior in the week or the day before that long run. How can we simulate a little bit more fatigue in the legs and not have them doing, 4 or 5, 6 hour long runs during marathon training? So I'm glad you're kind of in agreement there. Yeah, if we can talk about the whole zone 2 thing. Like, I know you recently debunked zone 2 myths, on your channel. Your audience loved it. For a runner training for a marathon, like how much of their weekly training should actually be in the easy versus kind of the hard zone? And like, where is the sweet spot for most runners?
Yeah, we have really gotten obsessed with zone 2 in the last like year or two, haven't we? Excuse me. It's certainly a really valuable training effort, and nevertheless that I've debunked some zone 2 myths or something like that. You should still spend most of your training time roughly in zone 2. I'm one of the all zones matter kind of guys, that I think there's value in every zone. We just have to kind of apportion our effort in each zone and the time we spend in each zone appropriately. So for example, it's going to be really hard for a beginner to get in a lot of zone 1 work, because any running is probably going to put them firmly into zone 2 or zone 3. So you probably shouldn't even worry about that. But an advanced runner, a really competitive runner might actually have trouble getting into zone 2. They might have to push somewhat hard just to get their heart rate into, say, high zone 2. Um, you know, if you're a professional runner, you can jog a 7-minute pace and your heart rate's probably 125 beats a minute. You're in zone 1. And that's just an incredible picture of aerobic fitness right there. So you might actually see an elite athlete with more zone 1 training than a beginner athlete. And that's just sort of a reflection of their abilities. They're also running probably a 90, 100, 120 miles a week. And so the mechanical wear and tear, the impact forces, all of the general impact of running, they're experiencing a lot more of it. So they probably do have to run in a relatively easier zone just to accommodate that extra mechanical stress that they're experiencing. But for most of us, I think there's a lot of value in zones 1, 2, 3 for developing aerobic fitness. We need to be cautious about too much time in zone 3 because of that mechanical stress. More advanced runners will find that their marathon pace is somewhere in zone 3. So, you don't want to be running all your training at marathon pace. My marathon pace used to be 6:05. There's no way I could be running 6:05 miles for all of my easy running, because it wasn't easy, right? It was sustainable somewhat, but I'm riding that line of kind of how fast I think I can run for about 2.5 hours. So you've got to be judicious with kind of the pace and heart rate and all of that. But yeah, zone 2 is where it's at. But there's a lot of value in zone 4 and 5 too.
Right. So it's not that magic pill, and that we should do all of our running there, but it is important. From what I'm hearing from you is just, yes, like if the goal is an easy run or a recovery run after a harder effort, like make sure it's easy and probably slow down, even though you can run a little faster, or you used to run at pick whatever pace, 8-minute, 9-minute pace maybe you should actually be running at a 10-minute pace, right? For that specific day in order to enhance recovery so your body can, continue to stay healthy during the training cycle. Before we go any further, if you've been feeling stuck, frustrated with nagging injuries, or even starting to wonder if your best running is behind you, I want you to hear this. This is a real runner who was in the exact place and what happened when they followed a structured plan with the right support. Take a listen.
Hey everyone, my name is Lisa Maciel. I am from Tewksbury, Massachusetts. I just wanted to come on here and share my experience with the Spark Healthy Runner program and share a little bit about my journey. So I have been a runner for just over 39 years now. I know it's crazy, especially since I'm only 29. No, just kidding. I'm 53. But I just ran my 27th marathon 2 weeks ago and was able to be fortunate enough to grab my 18th BQ Boston qualifier. But let me tell you, this journey was definitely different than prior marathons. It wasn't easy. It took me almost 2 years to get back to a marathon starting line because of recent injuries. Before my last marathon was October of 21 when I ran the Boston Marathon. I sustained some tendon damage in my foot for that. Last summer, I was on a run. I broke my 5th metatarsal in my left foot, so I broke that foot. And I was already qualified to run Boston for this year. 2 weeks before that marathon, I unfortunately pulled a high hamstring strain 2 weeks before. So I had to shut everything down and made that painful decision to pull out of Boston that weekend before. So that is when I started my journey to search for Duane. So that latest injury had me doing a Google search on high hamstring strain and somehow landed upon a video that Duane had shared with someone with a similar injury. So I immediately reached out and we got to work. I was impressed right out of the gate, I will say, with his knowledge, starting with a running gait analysis as well as a movement assessment. These were two things, simple things, but were never done on me before. Over the years, I've seen PTs over the years that have never suggested really looking at things like that in the depth that he did. Being in Massachusetts, him in Connecticut, it really had no impact on the success I had because everything was done, virtually. He was able to do all of that virtually. And no one had ever done that before, even the local PTs I worked with. So I will say that was really key to finding out what needed to be done. And my body is definitely unique, as Duane can attest to. I won't get into the details, but I definitely have a very unique body. He identified, problem areas. And like I said, we got to work, both with the running schedule and strength training. So I can easily say that the Healthy Runner Spark program is not a cookie cutter program like many you see online. Just with running shoes, one pair will not work for everybody. You may be doing strength specific work, which is great. I definitely am a fan of doing that, but what you're missing, it could be the runner specific exercises. And that I know is what one of the missing pieces that I wasn't doing. And so I'll be definitely continuing those for years to come. So our goal was to get that hamstring healed up so I could get to the starting line by September 10th. That was the last day to qualify for Boston for 24 for next year. So I literally picked the last weekend. So it was a little stressful knowing that I didn't have much time and that was going to be the last weekend. I had my last chance, really. So over the course of the 16-week program that I signed up with, while I had another issue pop up along the way, we adjusted my plan and we continued on that path. So with me, I know that this particular journey, it wasn't going to be chasing that PR. The number one goal was getting to that starting line healthy, which is what he helped me accomplish. And then I was able to get that BQ. And I know it's something, sometimes you just need to celebrate getting to the starting line. And it was a long 2 years for me, but my best advice is, don't give up. There are better things around the corner, and I know it's cliche, but every setback leads to a comeback, but it is true. Sometimes it can be longer than others. So there are worse things in life, that can happen to you that, and not, showing up at a race can be one thing, but in the grand scheme of things, there's more important things in life. But running is important to me, and it's important to many people. So this was this program that I was blessed to be a part of. I'm glad I stumbled across him on Google, and I can't say enough about the Spark program. Duane and his team provide amazing support. He made himself available to answer all my questions and any concerns I had. I can't recommend this program enough. So good luck to everybody else on their journey of running.
I truly hope that story inspired you and showed you what's actually possible. If you're looking for that level of structure, accountability, and support, you can check out the behind-the-scenes tour of our one-to-one coaching program. Just click the link in the description or scan the QR code. And if one-on-one coaching isn't the right fit right now, but you still want a proven system with guidance and an awesome community, check out the Healthy Runner Academy to help you run stronger, feel confident, and stay injury-free. Yeah, so I know, I can't believe it's like 45 minutes into this, Jason, and we really haven't even talked strength training yet. So I know I gotta, pick your brain here. One of the biggest questions we get from our runners is like, am I supposed to be lifting weights while training for a marathon? Yeah, what do you say to that, and how do you actually program that so you're not wrecking someone's runs during their training cycle?
Yeah, crucial point there. I don't think any strength training should be interfering with your running. In that case, we've got to restructure it. We've got to dial back the weight, the intensity, the duration, the volume, so that you're not so wrecked that it negatively impacts your running. But yes, I think runners should be strength training during a marathon season. I think it is the perfect complement to running. And I think the longer the race, the better complement it might be. I do think the shorter the race, the more you kind of have to focus on maybe more power output and heavier weights. But nevertheless, if we're just thinking about what happens to the body when we lift weights, we definitely want those adaptations as marathon runners. Everything from, probably the number one benefit, which is improved running economy, improved coordination and force output from heavier lifting. So, the longer the race, the more running economy is really going to matter. So I think doing everything you can to improve your running economy is going to be really important. And heavy strength training is a really good way to do that, especially if you're adding in some explosive movements, maybe a smattering of Olympic lifts. Maybe you're adding in a little bit of plyometrics too, so that you can harness some of that strength and turn it into reaction time, turn it into speed, really help you with more, running specific mechanics. So there's a place for all of this. And then the other type of strength training that I think is incredibly valuable for marathoners is just the easier body weight strength training that I prescribe to all my runners, borrowed from physical therapists like yourself, Duane, that you might do in your clinic. But I've created a lot of routines where we're just going to do it when we're healthy, and we're going to do it as prehab. 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes after each run, we're going to do a series of activation exercises, strength exercises, mobility work, all to help us, yes, gain a little bit more strength, but also improve our range of motion, improve our coordination, our general athleticism, our proprioception, help us cool down from the run. I think anyone who's run a hard workout or a long run, come home and then they sit in a chair and get lost in their phone for 30 minutes. You feel like you've aged 10 years getting up from that chair after that hard effort, and you're just sitting there. So we're going to do the opposite of that. We're going to go through a wide variety of different ranges of motion that you don't get any experience with if you're just running. And, of course, we're going to activate those muscles during those bigger ranges of motion, and we're just going to feel better throughout the day. And so I think if you're training in a marathon season, one of your goals should just be how do I get through all this training while still feeling okay on a day-to-day basis? It's really easy to feel pretty miserable when you're training for a marathon. If you're running high mileage, you're doing hard workouts, you're doing long runs, you're adding some of those downhill physiological resilience workouts to your long runs. my God, do you ever feel good? But this kind of easier body weight mobility work does a great job at just helping you feel a little better. And it also just improves your capacity for more mileage, capacity for faster paces, and probably your capacity to hold onto your better running form later in a marathon. You mentioned at the end of a marathon, you really see people falling apart, running mechanics falling apart, and I've joked around, like, if you want to see the saddest train of humanity, go to mile 25 of a marathon, and they're people are leaning to the side and their cadence is all off, and it's a very different group of people compared to mile 2. Mile 2, everyone's clear-eyed and they've got their whole life ahead of them. But mile 25, they're ready just to pack it in. And it's a very interesting look at the same group of people if you've ever had the ability to see mile 2 and then mile 25 of marathon. So we want to prevent that as much as possible and not fall apart. The strength training is going to be huge in helping us not fall apart. And so there's a place for the body weight stuff. There's a place for the heavy strength training. I think in an ideal scenario, we do everything. But in terms of like how to not have it negatively impact your running, I think the scheduling of it needs to be really important. You don't want to do a hard lifting session the day before a long run or a workout. You're just going to be carrying that fatigue straight into the run. We want to do it maybe the day of the long run or the hard workout. Now, that's very challenging. That's the most difficult option, but it does keep your hard days really hard so that you can then keep your easy days really easy. You can also do it on moderate days where, let's say you do your long run on a Saturday and you do like just a typical easy distance run on a Sunday. It's not like a 3-mile recovery run shakeout, but it's not a long run. It's not a workout. It's maybe a 6 to 8 mile run. Well, we might do the strength training on Sunday. That I think is a really good option. Then you might have an easy run on Monday, and then you're back to a workout on Tuesday. That I think is a really good option for scheduling in a heavier weightlifting day, because I don't really care if you're tired from running going into a strength workout, but I do care if you're tired from lifting going into a running workout. So if we can avoid that and still get in these critical workouts, improved running economy, improved force output and power, and there's some injury prevention benefits of strength training as well. And I think it also just gives runners a lot of confidence. They're not used to doing a workout and then feeling better after it, which I think is unique to strength training. You usually don't feel really great after a 20-mile long run or a really hard track workout. You need to recover. You need to build yourself back up. But strength training builds you up in the first place. And it just leaves you feeling like a more complete athlete. And I think there's a lot of value in that psychological phenomenon too.
Yes. So much gold here. The first thing I have to say is when you were talking about beginning of a marathon to like the end of the marathon, I got a flashback to my photos from Philly that I did last November. And in the beginning, I'm like, pointing at the camera, I'm smiling. I'm like, it's looking all easy. At the end, I'm like gritting my teeth. The form isn't looking as good. So I just got a flashback to those photos. But yeah, so much gold here with regard to like strength training during marathon training. From what I heard from you is you talked about like performance benefits and how it can help enhance performance, but then also like the injury prevention benefits, because if we're injured during our marathon training cycle, like we're not going to feel good going into it. We're not going to be able to complete the whole training. You're going to wind up taking a week off, 2 weeks before your race day because you got injured, right? So it's going to prevent that breakdown from the training. And then also recovery benefits. And that's something, Jason, that I recently started doing in the last couple of years, is actually doing strength training like after a workout. So during those tempo runs, during the week or a long run. The challenge is time-wise, obviously. But then the other thing is it is hard, and it's hard to get going initially. But I will say, even from personal experience, I would say I felt so much better after those strength sessions versus, like you said, when you don't do that during a workout where, you do feel somewhat sluggish. So I do see, and I don't know if it's just like we're really shuttling blood flow into the area. We're doing different movements. We're activating muscles that's protective for our joints and our tissues. But I do feel that there is that like recovery benefit where your body just feels better when you do that after those like harder run days. The challenge also for runners, you were remiss to not say, like the hydration and fueling has got to be really dialed in, right? And you got to make sure you fuel, obviously during the run, but then even in between, right? And then, when you're all sweaty, I get that question a lot too, is like, if it's summer and you're training hard and you're sweating, what do? You want to shower? Like, I'm changing all my clothes. You bring a whole towel just to wipe down all the sweat and then put a new outfit on and start doing your strength training if you're just like sopping wet. But it is amazing how it does make the body feel much better. And I would agree with you in terms of being a little fatigued heading into strength training is okay. As long as you're owning the movement still, right? And you're not sacrificing quality. And then the other point that you made too, which is amazing, is like adding in plyometrics, which is just so important for our tendon health. Really important for just that resilience, and we're mimicking the demands of running, but then the stability, the activation of certain muscles, the single leg stability, right? Like all of those things that you're going to focus on in strength training. Like if you have been training for marathons and haven't done it, like you're leaving so much on the table in terms of performance and preventing like the dreaded injury cycle. Or if you feel like you always have that hamstring pain that comes back every time you train for a marathon, have you been consistent with your strength training? Because that will be like key for you moving forward. So much gold there. Thank you for sharing that. And like our audience skews definitely more 40 and above, like masters runners, as we're called. For runners who have like the motivation, but whose bodies need a smarter approach, what changes about marathon training, like as you get older, and what do you do with your training plans that really caters to that like demographic of runner?
I think the number one thing is a conversation before the season starts, understanding that a 40-year-old runner can almost train exactly like a 25-year-old runner if you make no mistakes. And then as you get older, say you're 50, now we really have to start modifying the training. And it becomes more important as the individual gets older. So yes, you can train pretty hard in your 40s, but there's really no room for error, right? And so what does that mean? That means, you're going to do a dynamic warm up before you go running. We've got to run appropriate paces. We've got to not make classic training errors like, oh, I'm going for a run with my buddy. It's my recovery day, but he wants to run a little quicker. I'll just do that with him. That's a mistake that you can get away with when you're 25. And so a big part of it is just being very honest with yourself and saying, hey, I can't run faster today. Today's my recovery day. I just did a workout yesterday. I lifted weights afterward. By the way, I'm glad that you brought up fueling when it comes to like the days where you're running a workout and doing some strength training. I think you got to like have a burger in between. Like the fueling is so critically important. Yeah. And that's the other thing about, a master's runner too, is they have to think about everything. They have to think about their sleep. They have to think about their overall stress levels from their family and their job, where, when I was in college, I didn't have any stress. I was a double major and I was twice elected to student government. I still didn't have any stress in my life. Like it just wasn't that hard to feel like a pro runner in the way that I had all this time to train while still having like the normal college experience. But now that I'm 42 years old with 3 kids, holy moly, I've got a business, I've got kids, I've got a home, I've got all these things that I'm juggling. And part of it is just being self-aware enough to know what your bandwidth is for all the training. And so I don't think there's like incredibly different physiological responses or needs 40-year-old compared to a 25-year-old. But when you do start getting older, I think the number one thing that you have to keep in mind is the density of your intensity. So how much faster running are you including in your training? Probably the easiest way to modify training is just by limiting or cutting back on the faster work. So, maybe you typically do 2 workouts a week. Your first workout's a 5-mile tempo run. Your second workout is maybe 3 miles worth of intervals. Maybe that's at a VO2 max effort. Well, over time, maybe we continue to do 2 workouts, but that becomes a 3-mile tempo and you only do 2 miles worth of VO2 max work. Or maybe you do a 2-mile tempo and then 2 miles of VO2 max work after it, and you only do 1 workout that week. But you combine both of them and you do it in a way where you can hit both training paces. Mileage is not something that probably has to be seriously reduced until you're firmly in your 50s, you've hit 60, and now you need just more recovery in between your harder days. And you're not really going to get it with easy running the way that you could when you were, 30 or 40. So maybe at this point we incorporate more recovery days. Maybe we replace 1 or 2 easy runs with cross training so that we're not experiencing the same amount of impact. Maybe we increase our protein intake because older guys like me and you, Duane, I'm sorry to say, we're not synthesizing protein as efficiently as we need to. But we've just got to be clear about it. So maybe we increase our protein intake. We basically just need to be more process oriented and approach our running and our training more professionally. Of course, we're not professional runners, but can we be more professional about how we train, doing the little things? Just imagine that your sponsor and your, high level track coach is right next to you every day. Are they going to approve of what you're doing? That is a really interesting question to me, because if you're an average runner, but you think like a pro runner, you think like, oh man, Adidas and my pro runner coach are right next to me and they're judging the way that I'm executing this run, this strength workout, my entire, day of warming up and foam rolling and doing all the things that we runners need to do. We're going to make better decisions. And I think better decision making is the first step in how you modify your training when you get older. It's just, being more process oriented, not making the same mistakes that you made when you were younger, employing the wisdom that you've gained over the decades. And then, of course, cutting a little bit back on intensity, then cutting a lot of intensity, replacing runs with cross training, and then maybe cutting out the cross training so by the time you're 80 years old, maybe you only run 3 days a week. Maybe your workout isn't really that challenging. Maybe at this point, you can't even run lactate threshold and VO2 max workouts. You're just doing a lot of repetition work, relatively easy, but you're still running fast. And so there's this gradual evolution of training over the decades that sort of has to happen just because of our physiology. But that doesn't mean we can't still be training when we're 80 years old.
Yes, absolutely. I want to be training till I'm in the box, as I like to say. But yeah, I would also add to that, Jason, just like you spoke to the recovery time differences for, younger runners versus anyone over 40 or 50. But tendon health changes, right? Our tendons, they have changed from in our 20s and 30s. So like I mentioned before, doing a lot of the faster workouts or too much, like you had mentioned, it is going to affect our Achilles tendon, our proximal hamstring tendon, more so than it would have 10 years ago. So that is a physiologic change that happens. The blood flow isn't as good. Our tendons aren't as stiff and resilient. So you have to just take the steps like Jason's talking about and do the fundamentals and professionalize. I love how you said that, your approach to training, and not only look at it as we're just running. We're actually warming up and doing specific things before the run. We're doing things after the run. We're making sure we're fueling the runs and we're hydrating and we're making sure we're getting the strength training in. So all of that is going to keep us healthy in our 40s, 50s, and beyond. And the one little hack that I've really become more accustomed to, Jason, I don't know if you do this as well for your 40s, 50-year-old runners, is some of that speed work in putting in more rest periods, as opposed to doing, like you had mentioned, 5 miles, maybe a threshold, or like a 5-mile tempo run, or doing 3 miles even, honestly, at your threshold pace continuously, doing more of the broken, tempos and adding a minute recovery. Like, I found that super helpful for my athletes in their, 40s, 50s, who have a history of, stubborn injuries or reoccurring injuries, that little bit of just recovery kind of really helps keep them in the healthy zone during their training cycle. I don't know if you've used that at all for some of your speed sessions.
Oh yeah, 100%. I think, especially if we're talking about like a threshold workout or, marathon pace workout where you break up the total distance into segments. If you're only doing a minute recovery, it's actually fantastic, because it's not really enough recovery to dramatically change the response or the difficulty of the workout, but it is enough to give your body a little bit of a reset, both physically and psychologically, so that it's much easier to not only finish the distance that you want to run at quality, but maybe even add a little bit more. You might be able to do a 5-mile tempo run, but you might do 3 by 2 miles at the same pace with a 1-minute recovery jog. And that feels just as difficult as the other workout, whereas one is actually longer. You're getting more time at that quality pace. So there's a lot of different variables that you can manipulate to, make things easier or more difficult. And a couple of things that I wanted to mention too, both with regard to first with strength training. One thing that we didn't even mention was, if you're going to be lifting heavy in the gym, it's really important to periodize that weightlifting the same way that your running is periodized. Like, if you're doing a 20-week marathon plan, you probably don't want to be doing a really hard VO2 max workout in week 1. That probably flies in the face of how most training plans are structured. Again, we kind of get back to that peaking thing and building the capacity for those really hard workouts first. Same thing with strength training. You don't want to be doing really heavy, difficult strength workouts in the gym 4 months before your goal race. Let's treat it like running, in that we're going to build a foundation first. We're going to gradually add complexity, weight, difficulty to our strength workouts. And that's going to be a really important way of making it sustainable over the long term. So, as we talk about older runners, one of the ways in which we make training sustainable is again, in like the right decision making, and not just doing hard workouts all the time willy-nilly, making sure that they're appropriate for where we are within the season, I think is really important.
Yeah, great point. And last question here, Jason, I promise. I want you to kind of think about this, and I can even, give my take, which is going to be hard. But if you could fix one thing about how the average recreational marathoner is training right now, what would it be?
Is this going to be an entirely new podcast episode? I'm not sure we have enough time. I think I've already mentioned it. It's the fact that I think too many beginners attempt a marathon with performance goals, and they'd be much better off focusing on shorter distances first, becoming a better runner in general, so that when they go and do the marathon, it's easier. They run a faster time. They have a better experience. Their injury risk is going to be lower, and they're just going to be more likely to come back to the marathon, as opposed to the person who's not truly prepared for it in the right way. And then they don't have a good time. They run a time that is a lot slower than they were hoping to run. Maybe they get injured. It's just a subpar experience that then just doesn't leave them feeling really good about the marathon. So part of it is just preparation. I don't think the average American marathoner prepares as much as they should for the distance. Like I am someone who really respects the marathon. It's a difficult distance to do well. It requires a lot of physiological attributes that you don't get even from marathon training, which is why I don't like to see runners just marathon after marathon after marathon, and they're only ever doing marathon training. There's not a lot of VO2 max work. There's usually no repetition work. There's not as many tune-up races where you are running really, really hard. Yeah, and a half marathon tune-up, you can run hard, but usually, if it takes you an hour 45 or 2 hours or longer, it's still such a long race that you can't run it incredibly hard. You have to be judicious with your effort. And there's real value in running hard. We talked about running fast but not hard earlier. Now let's talk about running hard. Let's go run a mile or a 2 mile or a 5K race and go to the well. Run so hard that you see God, right? That you end up curled in the fetal position for 30 minutes after the race because you're hypoxic and you've never before blacked out after a race. There's real value in testing your limits in that way. And those experiences are some of the best stimuli for advancing your fitness level. If you're doing just moderate marathon training all the time, especially if you're really focused on zone 2, one of the things we didn't even mention about zone 2 is it really only helps you become better if you do a lot of it. So if you're running 20 miles a week in zone 2, it's not really doing that much for you. So that's one of the caveats about zone 2 is it's low intensity enough that it allows you to do a lot of it. But if you're not doing a lot of it, then, let's just run in zone 3 most of the time. And you're going to get similar benefits or even better benefits at those very low mileage levels. So yeah, a lot to think about when it comes to marathon training, huh, Duane?
I knew you'd have a tough time thinking about one thing.
Yeah. There's a whole laundry list of things we could probably go into.
If I had to just pick one, I would say for the average recreational marathoner you kind of alluded to this, is to enjoy the process and focus on the process versus the outcome. And I feel like most recreational marathoners, especially in the beginning of their journey, focus on the outcome and they want a sub 4 hour marathon, sub 3:30, whatever like your number is enjoy the process of training, because that is like going back to our why we run, right? I'm sure you're running because of the stress relief it provides you, like it does for me, and the physical benefits. And training for a marathon is great because it gives you that structured way to train and allows you to actually experience all those things. So focus on the process, focus on, hitting your longest distance ever, hitting workouts that you've never done before, and enjoy that journey. And I think it puts a lot of less pressure on the outcome for most recreational marathoners who, if it's not your, full-time job, like no one's caring what your time is on the clock when you finish your marathon, right? It's not going to change the people that love you. It's not going to change what you do during your everyday that you're not running. So try to just enjoy the process. Like we get the opportunity to do this as adults. We get the opportunity to challenge ourselves to run 26.2 and, cover this distance. So that would be my take there. Jason, this was like a masterclass in marathon training. It's always a treat to catch up with you and talk shop. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day today. And where can our audience best connect with you?
Probably the Strength Running podcast is the easiest way. And Duane, you're gonna be on my show either already or very soon, depending on when this episode airs, talking all about IT band syndrome, which is an injury I've had personally myself. So that'd be a good way to get exposed to the Strength Running podcast, is with you as a guest, Duane. But strengthrunning.com is our home base, and that's where you can find award-winning content library, all of our email courses, all of our training programs, more information if you want to know more about me and kind of my background with the sport and how I help runners. But, I just want to be available to anyone who wants to get better and loves this sport like I do. And if you're that kind of person, I'm happy to connect, happy to answer any questions you have, and hopefully help you run a good marathon.
Yeah, and I'll certainly put all those links in the show notes. And yeah, like I said earlier, you're like my go-to resource, Jason. So your content, whether it is on the podcast or on your YouTube channel, is definitely very, very helpful, and will definitely help our runners out as well. And if you guys enjoyed this chat with Jason and I, then you'll surely love our chat that we talked specifically about strength training as power training. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, queue up episode 171 on the Healthy Runner podcast. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll have that video for you next. And as always, guys, let's continue to grow a strong mind, a strong body, and just keep running. Until next time.